as accurate as the traditional way of reporting, which was for government folks to input the data into the systems. The where was somewhat easier. We decided to build two websites, one called federalreporting.gov, which was the website that recipients would go on with a secured password and input the data into the system. And then we built recovery.gov, which was the open-facing website that most of you, I'm sure, are probably familiar with. And with the geospatial technologies that we deployed from one of your sponsors in the back of the room there, ESRI, we were able to allow American citizens to drill down into their zip codes and see for the very first time where government monies were being spent in their neighborhood. It turned out that recipient reporting was as effective, I believe, as agency reporting. It turns out the recipients had a parochial interest in getting it right. We provided ways where if they got it wrong the first time, they could come back in and change it. The degree of transparency forced them to get it right because they didn't want to be embarrassed from their neighbors who they knew were going on these websites and seeing what they were doing with the money. So I became a believer that recipient reporting does work. I think as we look back on it, the website that we built, recovery.gov, was a first of a kind. And this whole endeavor became sort of a proof of concept of whether or not government data, particularly government spending data, could be standardized and become machine readable and useful for all Americans, citizens. So the fraud piece of this was made easier by the fact that the data was standardized. And I should say before I move on that there was a great debate about how much data we would collect. I finally put my foot down and said no more than 100 pieces of data. So naturally we came up to 99. As I look back, there's probably some data that we should have collected that we didn't, and there's probably some data that we collected that we really didn't need to do our mission. But it was 99 pieces of data for about 300,000 awards. At the time, we didn't know whether we could build an infrastructure big enough to support that kind of data. But it worked, and it suggests that, quite frankly, that other pieces of the government or the government as a whole should try to move as quickly as possible in that direction, and my hope is that it certainly will. The transparency and the fact that we had the data in a standardized format and were able to look at it was a force multiplier for fraud prevention. As we look back at the level of fraud, I'm very proud to say that it hovered for the 3 years that I was there, and still today, at somewhere around 0.5% of 1% of all the awards, which is a remarkable low level of fraud. And I happen to think that it's because, a great deal of it is because of the transparency of the data. Every American, every reporter in America could go on this website and see where this money was. And I think the bad guys just simply stayed away. They just went somewhere else. I mean, after all, you can still steal Medicare fraud, Medicare monies pretty easily, so why not go over there? And they stayed away from our money. And I think, you know, in the short time I have this morning, I'll just leave you with a couple of lessons. One lesson is that I think that a law is the way to ensure that the government moves quickly to standardize and make data machine readable. I think that the hope that agencies will move there themselves is, quite frankly, a little naive. As I look back on my 41-year career, I observed countless times some agencies complying, most agencies sort of somewhere in the middle, and some agencies not complying. So I'm a believer that that the Data Act that's been up on the Hill for a couple of years, that I was proud to work with Hudson in the early days on, I think should be passed, and it is the way to go. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm also very, very pleased and honored to be here, having had a chance to work with Hudson. I think since around the time the Data Transparency Coalition was getting going, it's fantastic to see this kind of gathering and this kind of interest. So as you heard from Don, I have a somewhat unusual background. Up until about 7, 8 years ago, I was a journalist and executive at Consumer Reports, focusing on consumer information. Today, I'm a senior advisor at the Governance Lab at NYU in an academic framework doing really cutting-edge work on the relationship of technology, government, and data and citizens, and how we can make that whole system work better. It's the brainchild of Beth Novak, who is the founder and director and a leader in this area for quite a long time. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about what happened in between in those last 7 years, because I think the projects and the work that I've had a chance to be involved in really reflects some of the more important trends that are happening with open data. So shortly after I left the Consumer Reports, I joined the Federal Communications Commission as chief of the Consumer Bureau under Chairman Julius Genachowski, who was very interested in empowering consumers through technology. And what that ended up meaning very much was empowering consumers through data. So the FCC did, I think, really some pioneering work in using open data to impact consumer markets in positive ways. So one example, we did the first scientific study of broadband speed and performance across the country. We found that one major internet service provider was providing less good coverage and less good service than its competitors during peak hours. Not surprisingly, one of its major competitors took out ads pointing to this fact, and the slow provider very quickly got up to speed and then took out ads saying they were now up to speed with an FCC endorsement that our tests showed that. So this was, I think, just a very classic case of how open data used in a market setting led to a major improvement in the kind of broadband service that millions of Americans received. Another project we did, which was a different kind of data, was we negotiated a voluntary agreement with the wireless industry on what we like to call bill shock, which is the phenomenon that happens when you get a cell phone bill that might be $1,000 or $10,000, or I kid you not, as much as $100,000, according to some of the people who complained to us. We thought that bill shock was an appropriate term. For some reason, the industry wasn't very fond of it. But at the end of the day, they agreed that they would send out alerts to users when they were getting close to their data limits or other limits. So those little alerts that you get on your smartphone now are a result of that. And in a sense, that's open data as well. So this whole idea that open data can transform consumer markets led through a lot of conversations I and others had together to the founding of the White House Task Force on Smart Disclosure, which I had the pleasure of leading with Sophie Rasman at the Department of Treasury, who is there now as the Director of Smart Disclosure. I think she may be the only person in the federal government with those words in her title, and she's a tireless advocate for this approach. Well, what smart disclosure means, and it's a term that came out of the task force, is it means the use of information and data to help consumers make difficult decisions. Nick Sinai was talking about some of these examples, things like credit card choices. Department of Transportation has done a lot of work on transparency. Health and Human Services has done a lot of work on health insurance. These are extremely difficult decisions to make if you don't have the data in front of you. And we think that one of the major business opportunities is for companies to begin as intermediaries that can really make that data much more usable to folks who are making these decisions. So that task force finally came out with its report last May. It's all available online. But in the process, we also, Cass Sunstein, when he was head of OIRA, issued a memorandum to agencies encouraging them to use smart disclosure. So we've seen it as a concept that's beginning to get some nice traction. So that work, for me, led into the larger question of how do you use open data in government to, or government open data to help improve the lives not only of consumers as consumers, but of people as citizens. That's very much what the Governance Lab is now working on. We have a well-stocked table with a lot of handouts right back in that corner. I hope you'll visit. Laura Manley and Cosmo Fujiyama are back there and can answer all your questions. But what I'd like to talk about today very briefly is a project that we're launching that I think may be of interest to many of you, which is the Open Data 500. We are now embarking on the first national census of companies that are using open government data as a major part of their business model. We are inviting companies that fit these criteria to submit their information for consideration in this listing. We see it as a listing that will get a lot of visibility and a lot of publicity, and it is also an opportunity to get feedback on how useful you are finding government data sets to be and how you think they could be made more useful. So we really want to encourage this dialogue between business and government around the use of data. And also to have 30 seconds of a personal plug, I suppose. In the process of doing all of this, I've also launched a free open website called Data.gov, which includes, among other things, my interviews with Hudson Hollister, with Nick Sinai, with some of the companies like the Climate Corporation that you've heard about. I hope that's of interest to you, and I do have a book coming out, which you can find out about at that table as well. But all of this work and the work that I've been involved in, I would summarize as making open data ultimately usable by the public, by businesses that want to serve the public, by consumers, and by citizens that want to participate in government. And we think that that's ultimately a grassroots approach that has tremendous potential. So thank you.
Good morning. As Don said, I'm an assistant secretary with the Department of the Interior, and I'm very pleased to be here today, not only with my distinguished co-panelists, but with all of you who are obviously experts in your field and thought leaders in the concept of data transparency. So the Department of the Interior is the agency to whom you have entrusted care of your public lands and waters and wildlife. And we have lots of data on all of those things. With respect to public lands, we have mineral assessments, we have oil and gas assessments, we have fuel loads for fires, land cover data, condition of grazing land. With respect to waters, we have data on surface water flows, water quality, groundwater levels in aquifers, reservoir capacities, fish and wildlife. We have data on endangered species, where they're located and their critical habitat. We have satellite imagery of the entire globe. And we have data that goes on and on. We have the National Wetlands Inventory. We have information on Native American cultural resources. We have elevation data. We have seismic data. So as Jeanne alluded, we have a lot of data. And making that data open to other federal agencies and to the private sector and the general public, that's been a particular priority of mine since I've been at the Department of the Interior, but much more importantly, it is a particular priority of our Secretary, Sally Jewell. She's very, very focused on capitalizing on our ability to provide information and data about our public lands, your public lands and resources, in a way that contributes to a better understanding and to better decision-making about the management of those resources. One of Secretary Jewell's highest priorities is to build a landscape-level understanding of the resources that we manage to contribute to better decision-making. We do have a long history of making our data available publicly. And in fact, it was the Department of the Interior's decision in 2008 to make our satellite imagery from our Landsat program available freely to anyone who's interested. That's what really started free open data in satellite imagery around the world. We make that, all the data that I talked about, available freely. Nick Sinai mentioned that EPA is working on making their water quality data available from real-time downloads through solar-powered projection to satellites. Just saying, we've been doing that for a number of years. Our stream gauge data is available. You can get it whenever you want it. You can get it hourly. That water quality data is available and easily accessible. This kind of spatial data is critical to just about every mission area that we have in the Department of the Interior. And we have a number of geospatial data professionals in our organization who organize that data, who publish it, manage it, and make it available for use. Because of that, we have a big head start in working toward compliance with the new Open Data Executive Order. And we are working hard to organize around the directives in that order. But we can't do that on our own. We have to partner with other federal agencies and with partners in state and local governments and in the private sector in order to make that data both accessible and effectively accessible. And that's what the Federal Geographic Data Committee is all about. The FGDC is an interagency consortium of about 32 member agencies. It was established in 1990. And the purpose of the FGDC is to coordinate federal geospatial activities through the development of standards. For one thing, we organize around different data themes and adopt standards for the data in each of those themes. Sometimes those standards have been developed by outside groups, and the FGDC examines the standard and adopts it. If there's a vacuum and a need for standards for a particular theme area, we'll put together a group that coordinates with other interested parties and comes up with a standard that is then considered and approved. The FGDC also coordinates among the different sectors that collect and produce and share data with the goal of reducing duplication of effort and creating efficiencies and allowing the collection and publication of data in a transparent and accessible way. I chair the Federal Geographic Data Committee on behalf of the Secretary of the Interior, and that is a key component of what I do at the department. The major focus of the FGDC over the past several years has been on building a shared data and technology infrastructure that can be used by all the FGDC agencies, but more broadly by the federal government, by governments in the states and localities, and by anyone who wants to use it. And that infrastructure is called the Geospatial Platform. It's a cloud-based repository for authoritative data. It's also a location for problem-solving applications that have been developed to utilize that data and to analyze it and provide it in a meaningful way. The geospatial platform is available. It's at www.geoplatform.gov. As Jeanne said, we have a lot of geospatial data sets. At last viewing, there were almost 90,000 data sets available through the geospatial platform. Version 2 of the platform is coming in the next couple of months, so you'll be able to access that when it's available. In addition to being a catalog of data sets, the geospatial platform is also a shared hosting environment for agencies that want a location to publish their data. And it's also a provider of tools that enable users to visualize the data geospatially and to begin to work with that data and create applications. And finally, one of the areas that we're very excited about takes off from the communities of interest that Jeanne described. We are creating communities of interest around the geospatial data that's available on the geospatial platform. And those will also, I think, see further development in the next several months. We have 3 communities there right now. One is for geospatial data managers to come together and collaborate around their uses of the geospatial data. One is for NOAA to use for all of its data and the kind of forecasting and predictions that NOAA does. And finally, we have a community that is focused on collaboration around river restoration and making rivers accessible and usable in their communities. And as I said, we're actively expanding the number of communities on the geospatial platform, and so you'll see them evolve over the next several months. The Department of the Interior and the FGDC are working very hard to keep the geospatial community at the forefront of the government's open data initiative. We do have a lot of good things in development now for the geospatial platform, and the Department of the Interior is the managing partner for the geospatial platform. And within our department, we have a champion at the very top who understands how we can use our data better, who understands the value of using geospatial representation to provide information and data in an understandable way to the general public. We're dedicated to taking advantage of the explosion in technology that has allowed us to progress as far as we've come, and we expect more great things. We'll take advantage of our Secretary's priority in this area. And finally, we want to take more advantage of our ability to partner with the private sector to create applications that that analyze and make better and more use of the geospatial data that we have available. I see us increasing our use of the open data that will be made available, all aimed at promoting this better landscape level understanding of our resources so that all of us can make better decisions about how to manage the taxpayers' resources in a way that ensures that they'll be there for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, each of the panelists. I'll open up a question for, we can start with Jeanne and get everybody's perspectives, but each of you have been dealing with data in your own domains and your own objectives for a period of years. Question I would have is, what have you seen have been the benefits of your efforts that you didn't expect, things that you saw that were like, I didn't really expect that would happen, but that's been an interesting byproduct of my efforts. And what are some of the things that you wish would have happened that didn't really sort of come to realize? Just sort of where do you think it went? We're sort of building this as we're flying the plane along data and where we're going. Just getting your perspectives about how it's gone so far and where you sort of think things went well and things didn't go well.
One of the things that I maybe didn't expect, I have big hopes for open data, so I had lots of expectations. And I knew that a big part for us in the first years was the change at agencies, and certainly with this latest executive memo moving to the default of all data being open, that's a big change. And there's been a lot of cultural changes within agencies as they've grappled with scarce resources and trying to accommodate it. But the change that I saw that was really unexpected was how people in the public sector are riffing off of each other. So, for example, we have this really great app that's come up called Asmopolis. So it looks at asthma instances. And so you put a GPS chip in your inhaler with your doctor's, acknowledgement, and it tracks where you have issues of asthma attacks. Really helpful if you're working with children, right, who are, it's sometimes hard for them to track it. And it turns out that just the knowledge of where your triggers are on your walk to school or in your community can decrease your daily attacks of asthma by 65%. I mean, huge. So Asthmopolis is this great app, really phenomenal. But there's another company called Relief, like on a tree. And Relief riffed off this data of where there are instances of having problems in cities with high asthma problems. And some open tree mapping work that's been done by one of our vendors in the back of the room to say where there's a lack of trees in cities. And Relief goes in and plants trees where they can decrease instances of asthma attacks by naturally increasing the oxygen in the vicinity. So, I mean, just this idea of, in energy, there's a ton of things going on with Green Button Initiative. This idea of kind of like watching others innovate and then innovating off that innovation. And the trust that's built, like, that data is going to continue to be there and be open, I think is really kind of an acknowledgement to what Anne was saying earlier of, we've been doing this for a while and we're all committed to doing it, so.
Excellent, very good. Earl, any?
Yeah, I think that my biggest disappointment, especially early on, was learning that every government agency has a different numbering system for contracts, grants, and loans. I sort of knew that, but I didn't.
Clapping to the audience for you.
I didn't realize what a major problem that was, particularly in the electronic environment that we were trying to operate in. We just simply couldn't match that stuff up between agencies. Even more shockingly is it took almost a year, well into 2010, before the agencies were actually able to come to us and tell us who they were giving the money to. Now, you'd think that would be a nice check for us to have if we were getting the data from the recipients as to what they did with the money, if we could match that somehow with what the agencies were giving out. But it took over a year for agencies to do that, and principally because their numbering systems weren't compatible with other agencies, and they had hyphens and stars and everything else in there. Some of these systems go back to George Washington. So I think that was a huge lesson. And there was another board created by the Vice President called the GATT Board, which is sole mission is to make recommendations to the administration on how some of the lessons of recovery could be taken forward into the rest of the government. And that is obviously, and has been already made as a recommendation, that somehow we standardize the numbering system. We need a single alphanumeric numbering system for all contracts and grants. I guess the most pleasant surprise I had was how much of a help transparency was, the data transparency was to preventing fraud. I mean, I was absolutely terrified at when I thought about the amount of fraud that could occur in a pot of money like $840 billion. And I think, as I said earlier, the transparency of this money, the ability for American public to actually know where it was, which was a first-time event, kept the folks that would come after it away. And it suggests, quite frankly, that we ought to do more of it. So those are some thoughts I have.
Okay. Joel, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, the experience of working with the task force on smart disclosure was very interesting and along these lines. The thing that we found that was very positive, we talked to about 25 different government agencies in the course of doing our report and recommendations, and we found that many of them were already doing the kind of thing that we would call smart disclosure, although it hadn't quite been named yet. So Consumer Product Safety Commission and others were doing a lot of consumer information on safety and recalls, financial information, health information, transportation information. A lot of this was already being put out there by agencies in ways that consumers could use. So that was very encouraging, and we hope that we helped them think about ways to continue to do that and reach consumers even more effectively. The big problem, I think, Earl, analogous to what you're talking about, is the lack of the difficulty in getting these data sets to talk to each other. So there was clearly great potential in seeing how these different data sets would mash up, and not easy to do. Now, one of the things that's come out of that is a project that's now being run by the governance lab called Orgpedia, that was started about 2 years ago and is now moving forward. What we're looking to do, and this has been developed with 3 round stones that has a table right out in the atrium there. What we're now doing is using linked data to pull together data from the Environmental Protection Agency, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, using as an initial data set the list of about 70 nuclear facilities in the U.S., and figuring out ways that you can take those different data sets and through a linked data approach make it possible to mash them up so that if you look at a single facility that reports to the SEC and is regulated by both EPA and the NRC, you can get a complete view of their history, any violations, their corporate structure, and so on. It's an example of the kind of thing that we think is possible to do, and we'd like to see done much more in making these different kinds of data sets possible to mash up, work together, and get new insights.
Let me give you an example of the power of open data policy that we saw from both sides of the spectrum. And that's with respect to our Landsat data. Landsat is a satellite that takes pictures of every spot on Earth every 8 days. It's really good for agricultural applications, looking at change, climate change, land use development, any of that kind of stuff. And before 2008, we didn't really have the technology to make that data available inexpensively enough to make it free. And so you had to pay the cost of processing and distribution of the data prior to 2008. We had about 20,000 downloads of imagery per year when we charged for the data. After 2008, when we went to a free data policy, and that was also driven by the availability of technology that drove down the cost, but after the free data policy went into effect, the downloading instantly accelerated, and now we're at about 3 million downloads a year, so more than 2 orders of magnitude in difference. So that's one example, but even more powerful than that, I think, is the development of applications using that data, and that's exploding in about the same exponential rate. And so we see huge beneficial applications that are coming online as people get creative around the use of this free data. Just because I love the asthma example, I'm going to give you another example of really cool things that happen with open data. I mentioned that we have a lot of seismic data. That's through the U.S. Geological Survey. And one of the things that they're doing with that data in California is putting together an earthquake early warning system so that if we have another big earthquake in the San Andreas Fault, USGS and Caltech have partnered to send out notifications because the way the seismic waves propagate, the farther away you are, the more warning you have that that earthquake is coming. You may have 5 seconds, you may have 20 seconds, you may have 40 seconds, but that's enough if you get that warning so that the fire station can open its electric garage door so that the fire trucks can respond when the damage occurs and not be locked inside the fire station. Surgeons in a hospital can withdraw